Alright, just momentarily going to be getting into this. I'm just sending out some announcement tweets so that we can maybe hit the ground running. I know it's late, and we'll see if this comes out as something that I'm going to leave up on the channel, which has a great deal to do with you and how we interact just now and whether my message and my thoughts hit home. This is going to be a little bit more of an analysis and a little bit more of an academic walkthrough of some of my thoughts on this topic. And this is in conversation with a fellow YouTuber, but we'll get into all that just a moment. The title of tonight's stream is called How Monsters Got Weak. Let me pop out chat, and I'm going to make sure that it's here on the other screen so I can hang out with y'all. And let's get going. Good evening. How's everybody doing? As you can see, I've maybe got the lighting a little bit more worked out, and there's maybe a few other things that seem a little bit more polished. I know that the audio is still coming along. One thing that I can say that is not completely up to grade is that I don't know if you're familiar with how red ale really tastes at its absolute best when it's somewhere around 29 to 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and it gets progressively less and less like something that has its own identity and more like just kind of a beer I don't want to finish. Well, I pushed my luck a little too far, and it started out as a slushy. And so that's the reason that I've been playing chicken with starting the stream, is hopefully to get this to a point where I can take a few sips of it as we embark on this journey to ask the question of, how did monsters get weak? Now, what I mean by that is, if you've played 5th edition D&D, if you've worked through this monster manual, you will note that the challenge ratings and the way things go, generally, any given monster, it has got a ticking clock on its life. And as much as it looks like there's a lot of contingency and stochasticity to combat with all those dice and all that rattle and hum going on, in many respects, the level of uncertainty and for my part, one of the things that I found was the deficit of real role-playing and choice-making that I had once combat started, as far as embodying the persona of the monster, really couldn't get into character because of something that was kind of pushing in a different direction that I found as far as how these guys were set up. Now, of course, there is a pat answer even to this discussion about why monsters be weak nowadays. And the pat answer is, well, go do it yourself. Why don't you just go fudge the dice? Why don't you make them tougher? In the last stream, we visited that, and in particular the Sly Flourish answer, which is to just kind of nudge the hit points this way and that, to say the monster hits when they didn't, say they did more damage than they did or didn't, based on your own sensations and feelings in the moment, to keep people entertained at the table. Now, of course, I'm developing an overall narrative here on my channel about a way of playing which I think existed before all that talk about razzle-dazzling folks and keeping your players entertained, a different way of sitting in the referee or dungeon master's chair. And that's, of course, a meta topic, which we're getting deeper into. But I want to actually focus on some history here. I don't really want to debate the idea that monsters, are comparatively not where they were in other editions, because I think that's a question that's largely been answered. It's something which is out there in the zeitgeist, and one answer is that's fine, and that's intended, and that's sort of part of the feeling of having heroic characters in 5th edition D&D, and I kind of agree with that one. And the other one is that if you wanted a different way, then all you need to do is noodle around with stuff behind the screen, and if you're a real big man dungeon master, then you can do that for yourself. That's the mark of a true grown-up DM is that you can force it if you want it a certain way. I have another answer, which is, of course, more nuanced because that's what we do here on the channel. And so maybe this will stir up some stuff. I'm absolutely certain that some people will laser down on particular things that I say in here, split hairs. Some people will look at the thumbnail and listen to the first 4 minutes of me talking and then write 1,000 words. But this video is about more than that. We're going to visit an AD&D adjacent game for our sampling of first edition AD&D monsters, Hackmaster 4th edition, which of course is a real favorite of mine. And we're going to move through the evolution of what a monster manual entry really was and why it was. And why are we doing this? What's the purpose of asking this question? And what are we trying to do? Well, one of them is that I want to enter into a little bit of conversation with my friend Ivan from Ivan Mike 1968, who's a fellow theory crafter and contemplative YouTube RPG guy, and whom I played with for a number of years, and perhaps I will again. Of course, as you all know, I withdrew from the world of Facebook and social media, and so I'm watching my friends from afar and thinking about some of the things they've said. Ivan, in this video, which we're looking at right here, commented on his experiences running 5th edition. Now, he's an OSR guy, a basic fantasy guy, and a Lamentations of the Flame Princess guy. That's his center of gravity for the most part. He introduced me to Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, pretty good 1st edition AD&D derivative game. And he got me to think more about my style and my philosophy when I was behind the screen. And that was a really welcome process that went on for a number of years. And so I want to get back to that. And Ivan's got this new set of experiences because he's running 5th edition for kids at the library. And one of the things that he's observed is that, 5 goblins and maybe a hobgoblin or a bugbear, and they're duking it out. They're mucking things about with maybe a few 3rd level adventurers down in a dungeon, and maybe there's the chance that the things might snowball and they might stumble into another room where there's maybe a roper. Who knows? Just a natural dungeon environment that's got different kinds of stuff that makes sense for it to be there. And in spite of all that, in spite of kind of the great many contingencies and weird ways that things can go sideways, he's noticed that the monsters, they kind of got a clock on them. And but there's a philosophy to that. Part of it has to do with the competence of the characters. And I think that it really strongly interacts with it, in ways that, Ivan didn't really start to split hairs about, but I'm excited to with you here. But I want to walk through kind of how I think that this is the product of a series of events which began with a reaction to 3rd edition, 4th edition, Pathfinder, Pathfinder 2, and the way that things were going in the culture of play, and that, we arrived here by a stepwise action. This really was a matter of evolution. That this is the choices that were made that led to these monster manual entries being surprisingly floppy, and really it takes a lot of pushing from you, the dungeon master, to attempt to interject a sense of peril from monsters that, when they faced against other editions, adventurers, brought some serious peril. And, this is comparative adventures as far as their sort of tier, if you can think of the different Vancian spells. So 3rd level adventurers, 5th level adventurers, the kind of spells that they can bring to bear, the kind of influence that they have in their worlds, the number of adventures they have under their belt. You take a 5th level adventurer from 5th edition D&D, and you compare them with, I don't know, say something like a Bat Zoo demon, those teleporty spiky guys that are very sneaky. And, his chances and the way that he'll regard an encounter with those sorts of demons, 1 to 4 to 6 to 10 of them with his companions, as he fights those monsters over and over again, what is he going to think of them as far as whether his life is in danger? And you'll get different reactions from that same set of multiple combats and experiences. You'll get different senses of peril in different editions. And that's, in some places, and for some of us, that's one of these kind of sensations that the genre has changed. I'm still playing D&D. There's still adventurers. They're still working through multiple perilous encounters and sensations and confrontations down in a site-based environment sometimes, otherwise known as a dungeon. But something's going on. These guys are a little bit more super, and the bad guys feel a little bit more like sort of Potemkin villages or obstacles that are put in their path. So what's that all about? Well, one of the things that I keep returning to is this George R.R. Martin quote about how there's two types of writers. There's architects and gardeners. The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. They know how many rooms are going to be in the house, what kind of roof they're going to have, and the wires, where they're going to run, and what kind of plumbing there's going to be. They have the whole thing designed and blueprinted out before they even hit the first nail or put the first board up. And this is the subtle kind of long-term movement which has happened with the way that monsters are regarded in D&D, and the way that the goal of the monster manual in some respects, and the way the monsters are presented. We've moved, especially from a peak in 3rd edition and 3.5, of the simulationist, symmetrical idea of the monster as an entity in the world, and the monster's stat block is representing a real thing that's out there kind of doing and bubbling about, and that has come by its own abilities, its own survival, and its own treasure, and its kind of its enemies and its friends and foes and its situation. That monster in a prior edition's rendition, as it's presented for you to bring to the dungeon, in a manner of speaking, it's set up there as a thing, and so you can strategize with it as the dungeon master, and it lives and breathes as a simulacrum, and it's sort of like a seed in some respect. There's not a lot of determinant as to what it will become. You can railroad that, you can see how things happen, but ultimately it's a tool in a toolbox in this monster manual. And by stepwise action, this monster manual has arrived at sort of a theater, sort of a mode or mindset. This is a monster that I know is going to end up in a combat or encounter with the protagonists of our story, and this monster, because of the capabilities that is assumed to be there for the protagonist, it's got maybe about four rounds of combat to its name before it will be eliminated. So in those 4 rounds of combat, what we're bringing to the table with these monster manual entries is sort of a facsimile or kind of a glamour of what those monsters are in the genre, what people want to see and experience, and what dungeon masters want to kind of bring to the table and have their parties feel and experience. So, for example, there's a certain amount of peril in these monsters, but it's there to sort of push people's buttons, to razzle dazzle, in a manner of speaking. Now, it's very subtle. It's much more subtle in this monster manual, the 5th edition one, than it would be in something like the 4th edition monster manual, or maybe I could poke a finger at Pathfinder 2's bestiary, although they're kind of on about the same level. But we're gonna look closely at sort of how things are presented, and I want to hopefully prove this idea that there's a shifting intent to what is being presented and why and how the game imagines that it's going to be used, and it's much more sneaky. There's a sneakiness to what's going on. You see what I did there? I made those waves start moving. Uh, if I hadn't mentioned that, I'm not sure anybody would have noticed. But the thing that's going on with this fifth edition monster manual, is that right out of the gate, there's a lot of secret noodly math that has happened with things like the saving throw difficulties and especially the HP and the AC. And you'll notice that the monsters in this, there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to how many HPs they have. If you were expecting them to have like a number of hit dice, or for them the HPs to come from sort of a, a meat bag of a certain size. And likewise, the armor class is it is what it is. So in like a BX style D&D or an AD&D 1 style game, uh, plate mail has an analog in the monster kingdom, if you will. And so the AC of a monster, when it's AC 0 or AC -1, we're starting to represent, and we're deciding that it has that AC, and the players are imagining that it has that AC as their sword swings are hitting home or not, and that there's sort of an analog to a fighter with full plate and holding a shield. But there's no kind of relationship so much anymore. And that's because the decision, the reason that it has a given HP and AC, in large part, it has to do with its endurance. The choreographed intent that's kind of hidden from view, but it's still there, which is kind of how long this monster has to live. And regardless of how it's operated and how the player characters are operated, even if the player characters are operated pretty poorly, they're probably going to try and attack. And they're probably going to have advantage on a good number of their attacks, for example. And, there's a reasonable expectation about how much damage they're going to do. And working within that, there's this choreography. And so there's a limited number of actions that it's anticipated the monster can take. And then from there, the monsters the actions that they get are meant to, they're included and they're presented to you, the dungeon master, in the entry. And I'm going to prove this. I'm going to show it to you. They're presented in a completely different way and with a kind of a different aesthetic and idea than older days. And in many respects, this is a reaction to how difficult it was to run third edition monsters. I'm not going to equivocate about this. I mean, the way we got here is that it was hard to do all the math of 3.5 D&D for a lot of people, and especially because, still at the end of the day, the players were victorious most of the time. And so the monsters, they went the way. They went, get out of here. But nevertheless, you had a lot of little tweaky bits. And I'll show you some of that stuff as we move through here. So here's the present. Here's an adult red dragon. And this is what's going on. They've got an armor class. They've got hit points. Okay, well, what's going on? Oh, okay, well, I guess they are talking about the hit dice here on this. This is very interesting. They're actually going to tell me, oh, I see. Those aren't exactly hit dice. I get you. Okay. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, because 133, I don't think 7 is divisible. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, all right. 19. Okay, yeah, all right. That modifier does jive with that Constitution score. 19 die 12. Oh, okay, all right, fair enough. That is sort of representing 19 dice of meatbag that's out there in the universe. Okay, fair enough. The thing that I want to point out here is, we're throwing out this really basic stuff about sort of here's the actions it can take. This is what it can do. These are the legendary actions that it can do. And this is so there's weird meta concept, which I don't object to, and I think it has its place and it's sort of interesting. The legendary actions are these out of turn actions that really super duper monsters can do out of the order of initiative. That's a concept, a game concept unique to 5th edition D&D. I'm very supportive of things like squad mechanics for minions. 4th edition D&D had the very popular minion rule, which we'll maybe consider why that went away. But that was the idea that there were certain kind of monsters that everybody was always expecting should go down in one hit that are sort of there to kind of take up space and kind of create this feeling of being outnumbered and block the exits. The mustache twirling villain, says, "Oh, guards, stop them." And so these are the hordes for like a Dynasty Warriors side kind of style aesthetic. And it also, reduces a lot of bookkeeping for the dungeon master. And, I prefer the squad mechanic from things like Fantasy Flight Star Wars and Conan 2-20. And for that matter, I think there's no reason that D&D couldn't have something like a horde of orcs that just takes up, 9 spaces, and we abstract their cloud of attacks, their full press of combat, and we take away the bookkeeping and the headache of kind of tracking which guy took damage and so on. That's how I like to take care of that sort of thing. Notwithstanding, legendary actions are sort of a cloth of that. And we have to recognize that it's sort of a genre mechanic, or maybe it's just a result generator. As in, this monster would really go down pretty quickly without doing all that many things. And then people wouldn't get to experience fighting this red dragon. If it just flopped over in one round and only ever took one turn, people would look and they'd say, "Oh man, that was disappointing. Wow, that was anticlimactic." And at the end of the day, what do legendary actions do? What do they achieve as a game mechanic? And I would put to you that the main thing that they do is they avoid anticlimax. And they make sure that confrontations that should, quote unquote, feel intense, they give an extra gravity to those confrontations that the system intends that people, or rather the system expects the people's expectations. It envisions that out there in the world, people are anticipating a fight with a doomy vampire will in fact have a doomy course. And so this is coming in there and making sure that happens. Wouldn't you say? Well, you're welcome to disagree, and that's what the stream is all about, is provoking some discussion. Here is some things to contemplate about kind of the evolution of Monster Manual entries. So here's the 5th edition Displacer Beast entry. And so you'll notice it's got this kind of pseudo double-spaced font. There's a lot of blank space around the text. There's a lot of room for the text to just be. And this makes sight reading it really easy. It makes finding a data point that you may have missed really easy. It also means that you just can't fit as many words in there. And, especially when it comes to lore, I don't know that I really would be looking up a specific point of lore, so I don't know why it has to be double spaced, but that's, it's consistency. And plus, that's just fewer words, so people feel less intimidated by, how complicated or how hard it is to learn D&D. Notwithstanding that this is a library item and you don't need to memorize it, because you're only going to look it up when you're fighting a displacer beast. But okay, I get it. I mean, this is one of the goals of this edition, is to make everything feel, approachable and cozy. So that's what that looks like. Now, somebody, did an analysis about what the different proportion of stuff is in this Monster Manual entry. They did not talk about the gross volume of stuff that is in here. And that's the thing that I really want to contrast. Because if you move over here to the 4th edition Monster Manual and its Displacer Beast entry, notice that the density of the text is considerably higher. The gross amount of information is a good deal higher. There's not many double spacey stuff in these numbers that are here. They're crunched together pretty hard. Like it would be hard, looking down at this entry to just run it off the page. I'll be honest with you. And the lore is pretty scant. One thing that I'll note here is that, I don't know who looks in the monster manual to learn about monsters. I would expect that a campaign setting would do something like that, or just your experience of things like adventure modules, your experience of just the wider genre of fantasy fiction would kind of fill in this, or maybe it would be for the game master to just sort of invent for themselves and sculpt for their own world and their own ideas. So, this person is obviously noted that only 8% of the stat block in the 4th edition Displacer Beast is lore. Well, I would put to you, I would ask for a moment, who says that the Displacer Beast Monster Manual entry is really the place for lore? Interestingly, though, the other thing that I'll tell you about this, notice what's not there in this one, okay? Even in this lore entry, and this is not going to be sufficient resolution, you'll just have to take my word for it. One of the things you won't see is a number appearing. You won't see things like organization. You don't see something specific like ecology. What does it eat? I'm not even certain that it says what terrain you'll find these monsters in. Which is, that's an interesting supporting point that, used to sort of describe, that it existed in the world. It spoke to that. And it's not there. And there's certainly not, the effort is spent on a different sort of lore. It's placing the monster within, genre expectations. Like, okay, what is the point of a Displacer Beast? Oh, it comes from the plane of the Fae. Here's some legends about it. Here's we're gonna vamp it in some respects and sort of give you some spicy ideas about why it might be around, which is cool. It's cool, and it certainly helps beginner people develop their acumen and their cookbook. It's considerably more beginner friendly as far as like, okay, I gotta come up with an idea right now, and I gotta run an adventure for my friends. They're expecting it. It's gotta happen, man. And that's what this does. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't sort of abide. This is not a creature that is alive, or rather, the stat block being presented is not something which facilitates something which just lives in a world when it's not being attended. Now, let's move on. Let's look at this red dragon stat block from 3rd edition D&D. Whoo, boy. Ooh, that's a lot. And this is not even all of it. This goes on. No, I'm not even going to show you all of it, but this is their ability scores. This is their base attack, and you gotta count their ability score with that, and then some of their attacks, which we're not going to tell you right now, use I think some of them the Constitution score determines which dice, if I remember. Like a really chonky dragon has a bigger tail thonker. And each red dragon is a bespoke creature. And, even to the point that I enjoyed picking out their feats and sort of kind of creating a really specific personality and sort of making a sort of a thought about how this particular dragon hunts and how this particular dragon intends to come out alive and what its goals are in combat with the party. And I would look at that stat block sometimes, and I would use the tools that were in the system because it was totally symmetrical. Monsters got player feats, and that was the way it was. You didn't have to house rule that. You didn't have to add it in. You could add extra hit dice to a monster to represent a bigger, chonkier, more boss-like monster. You could even throw class levels onto a monster, and there was a procedure. It was all very difficult in the sense of it involved a lot of numbers, and it was for a monster that people were never going to see again. And so it took time. I will put to you that nowadays, a lot of that work could be done, frankly, by an app. Could be done visually and graphically by dragging and dropping things, and most of the formulae could be happening in real time on a website. And frankly, if there was the will, people could do that right now with 3.5 monster creation. And there could be a website that would do that, like literally for free, like off of ad revenue if somebody wanted to. Things didn't go that way. And even in the twilight of 3.5, back in the Pathfinder days, Hero Forge got a license to make the software, and it was expensive, frankly. And it was not cloud based, and it didn't really get pirated or anything. Not that I would support doing that, but the tools to make it easier to make monsters in the 3.5 days and get them to the table ready to go never materialized. And there were not books of like ready to go monsters that people made in large part. And the stat blocks of the monsters themselves really, they're not actually combat ready in many cases. The amount of different rules that are interacting in a 3.5 monster, and the amount of like the spell like abilities, for example. You don't want to page flip to the spell like abilities, and to really have good knowledge of like, okay, this monster is going to use this spell like ability that it wakes up every morning being able to do, right? So, I usually when I used to run 3.5, I would literally go and get every spell and copy paste the spell, and I would have these like 5 pages of information about these higher level monsters sitting ready to go for a combat. Um, and I'd load it up. And for things like doppelgangers, good lord, the number of different interacting rules is insane. I have a diagram, and if people get excited about the stream, maybe we'll go look at that diagram of all the different rules that are feeding into a 3.5 doppelganger. Suffice it to say, those rules that are all feeding into each other, I think it could be fine that it's all very complicated if there was access to it, if it was easy to get to, if you could tear out, the red dragon of the week and have it ready to go, or print it out, and it was all the stats were ready to go, like little tick boxes ready to go, and it had all of that stuff worked out and usable right there in the moment. It didn't go that way, frankly, and usually the stat blocks were optimized to take up the least amount of space. And in Pathfinder 1, that's the way that they went. And, there's even huge communities have developed throughout the course of the Pathfinder 1 Adventure Path run, where people would share their prep for the adventure path, and kind of share their, getting all the encounters actually ready to fight. Because good luck running a battle in an adventure path like straight out of the softcover wobbly book. Because you would have to be a savant, and I'm not really sure. Yeah, even in my best days, I'm not sure if I would be up to it. When I pulled out encounters out of a hat, on the fly, improvised encounters in 3.5, I really could only do it with humanoids. I could really only do it with things that had class levels. And I could do it pretty good. But to do it, in other areas is, wow. And, frankly, this led to a feeling that there were barriers to entry for dungeon mastering. This led to, and a sensation that there was a lot of fatigue and burnout for doing this stuff that, after all, it couldn't matter that much. And with that in mind, some people started looking at this, and some of the designers and some of the people who influence designers started saying, well, what if we change the game so that it could produce the results of fun combat encounters without all this work? What if we could make that even more reliable, so that people wouldn't have to worry about this stuff? What if the players could feel like they were in danger and they were fighting this monster and they were losing hit points and They would be bashing away at this big sack of meat points, but they would feel satisfied because they were hitting that low AC, and they were rolling the damage die. That's fun, isn't it? And they even if the monster resisted fire, even if the monster was never immune. That's one of the things about 5th edition that you'll also notice, that instead of resistances, where it subtracts 20 from how much fire damage the monster takes, it just takes half. And so the players always have this feeling that they are making progress. That progress bar, that monster's HP is going down. And that's satisfying. That's good, right? Well, where did it go from there? Well, you start to think, okay, well, what's supposed to happen in a combat with X monster? You start to ask the question as you're designing a monster manual entry. You start to say, well, what do people expect, or what's supposed to happen when this kind of monster fights adventurers in D&D? And there are really iconic examples of this in the 5th edition monster manual. Vampire comes to mind. That it dominating and charming the party members is something that's flipping at least one party member in the course of a vampire fight. It's something that you'll see discussions about, and people can even share their experiences with, like, oh, in our fight with the vampire in level 2 of that dungeon, and that'll be a discussion that you'll see often repeated in the internet. And so this creates shared experiences. It's sort of free advertising when people talk about, like, well, when we fought things in Curse of Strahd, when we got to that fight, oh yes, I also was charmed by the vampire. I made my save. And so it's sort of programmatic, and the vampire lands there, and he's just and there's like these 4 buttons for the GM to press to do vampire. There's very little material on that 5th edition stat block to do things outside of combat, to, in a fair manner, represent the vampire sneaking around, influencing hirelings, setting traps, gathering information, gaslighting the player characters and making them doubt their own sensations, creating a spooky atmosphere. That's not a matter of the vampire's skill and acumen. It's what's being tested. In many respects, it's just the game master's theatrical abilities which are being tested there, which is, maybe that's okay. It is, in some respects, sort of ironically kind of that classic oppositional dungeon master thing going on, where it's like, can you really pull it off as the DM without the help of a stat block? Real man dungeon masters can. Double dog dare you. And that's sort of what the bare bones stat block says. Now, notwithstanding this, I want to point out that I'm not against some of these programmatic things. I think in some cases it actually is important to representing the monster in the world, to letting the monster come on screen in a way that's consistent with what people think that monster really is. So, for example, a puma, an ambush predator, in a GURPS stat block or a Rollmaster stat block, there's very little going on as far as, like, how does that puma get to a ledge and wait for a party to walk under it. There's very little going on with that as far as, the invocation of combat, what the distance that the encounter begins at. There's nothing in the stat block that's going to tell you that and change it. It's something that's just, there's at least a genre expectation that in a pulpy short story, sword and sorcery type thing, Conan, walking down a trail in the jungle, he's going to come face to face with this. He's going to brandish his spear, and the puma is snarling, and it's hungry, and there's this moment of terror, then this moment of contest of wills, and perhaps the brave hero is able to, impress their will upon the beast And there's this potential that maybe the beast will become the hero's companion out of a respect for his mega predator instincts or whatever. Okay. The thing is that if you don't have some sort of mechanical facility on the monster to get to that ambush moment, for example, ambush moment, or it could be a possessing type of demon that gets in people's heads and makes them do silly things. This something that sets the table and brings that monster into focus in a relevant way. This could be a dragon raiding livestock, or bursting through a doorway. The cave troll, for example. Making sure that the cave troll can bash down the door in Moria on that stat block, I would argue is pretty relevant to having cave trolls in the game. So I want to give a little bit of clarification about that. Now, one of the contrasts here, and one of the things that I'm returning to repeatedly here on the channel, is this idea of why do these things take place? Why are given things happening in the narrative of the game? Is it because of the way that things work in the world? That there's a mechanics at play in the world of Gundam? There's a reason that fusion reactors work the way they work and why Gundams became the way they are. And warp cores, the deuterium shoots down this way and the anti-deuterium shoots up this way, and there's a dilithium crystal in Star Trek and energy shoots out the side and as super duper plasma, which is then piped through the ship to power the ship's systems. And so it's not just energy points. There's not just a power statistic. There's a thing which exists in the world. And the ship doesn't have power because the writer said so. This is an ongoing, debate about, whether the lampshade exists or not. But suffice it to say, the pretension of a lampshade is there. But when we walk down this road, things start to get different. So, at some point, we push over the edge, and the Monster Manual entry is no longer about bumping into something which is going about its business in the world. The Monster Manual entry is now about a man with a gun bursting through the door, because that's what's exciting. And with that in mind, we're packing in the exciting stuff that people expect about guys with guns into those 4 rounds that we're expecting the monster's got to live, rather than giving the monster a life to live away from the combat with the player characters. So, is the adversary an NPC? Is the adversary an entity in the world, with its own will? Or is the adversary sort of a pawn or a plot point, a thing to shove into into the front of the camera to make things exciting, to wang, bam, fizzle. And there's just sort of I'm not saying that it's forced. I'm not saying that the newer way of writing Monster Manual entries is forcing you down this path of inanimate or kind of Potemkin village monsters that don't have an intent. Obviously, you can work these things out in your head without resort to mechanics. What I am saying is that, much like people say D&D is all about combat and violence because look at how much rules there are about combat and violence, I'm saying that, what's there? There's those legendary actions, those layer actions, which are there to spice things up. That's my experience of them, is that they spice things up and they make sure the monster does something. They avoid anticlimaxes. And they're also weirdly asymmetric. Players don't get that. Nothing else gets that. Why do they get legendary? Where did that come from? And it's sort of outside of the normal tempo of the game. Like, it would be another matter in a 2 die 20 style game where there's a lot of mechanical gears turning with how things can happen out of turn and how things can poof into existence, or suddenly happen with a beat of music. It's uh, it's it's kind of exceptional in D&D to see this thing like a legendary action suddenly appear for this special monster, and it's like, oh well, I guess that's to make sure it's special. I mean, that's what I think. There's sort of some messaging which is happening, especially to new people, and one of the things is that there's absolutely zero introduction to this idea of the animate monster that exists and is going about its business, the animate NPC that is not there to challenge or to be an obstacle or a mustache twirler, but is a villain or a counterpart, a real living evil, or just a thing that is that might want to eat you. The game just isn't introducing that idea, and there's no support for that idea really in the mechanics anymore, which means that more and more people like me who like that idea are thought of as exceptionalists. We're the weirdos now. I see it. I see it happening in the culture of play, that more and more, if you look at the monster as something which doesn't want to die today and is trying to get away, and like, why didn't you let us kill the bad guy, like, oh yeah, just put a letter from the orc's child in their pocket to make the players feel bad, not because the orc necessarily has a child. Just throw it in there. So I'm seeing more and more of that kind of thinking about choreography, about razzle dazzle. And the other side of it is that it's just a matter of like, how can you compute the impacts and the absences? The truth of it is that in some respects, that sadness of orphans and widows, well, what's really gone? There's a quantifiable absence in some respects, which you can envision, and that exists when the monster is like an entity in the world. And if a village loses its cleric, who may have been dabbling in necromancy, what did they lose? I mean, they certainly lost, in most people's conceptions, they lost their health care. When you look at, especially NPC stat blocks, things like soldiers and mages and so on, they don't look anything like a player character in this book. They're kind of this bizarre meat bag. That doesn't, it's very hard to use that to inform world building and events. And I think that there's a subtle messaging, and there's certainly no mentoring coming from the mechanics. There's certainly no legitimacy for, the other way any longer. And, as this is the game that most people are now playing as their first game, I'll tell you that that's going to have an effect. And as this is the game that most people are picking up and they're chattering about on Twitter, most of the conversations are going to judge whether something is exceptionalist, out of place, a weirdo idea, or a normal idea. That is going to be evaluated based on the context of what the rules look like and how the rules introduce themselves and what the rules play out as in a default way. If you're not trying to force it, if you're not trying to push something, how does it just kind of go if you just kind of go with the flow? And, the assumption is that most people will be going with the flow, and so they want to give you a good go with the flow experience with these stat blocks. And that's where we're at. So what are some things that, that you miss out on? Well, one of them is something like a two-way fog of war. Like, what does the monster not know? I revisit this often, and I've talked about this in a couple other streams, but if you want to have a situation where the party, if you want to explore a given kind of dungeon where the party's sneaking about, smog comes to mind, and they want to go in a side door and infiltrate a site. What is the level of awareness that the monster has, that the opposing forces have? How do we calculate that? How do we imagine that? What is the reach of their senses? We have a passive perception score, um, but I can't give you a whole lot more than that as far as like spell-like abilities, and can't give you a whole lot more than that about what's a reasonable expectation about what sort of monsters they may have reporting to them. What sort of devices could the monster craft in its spare time? These are questions which are they're not being considered by the stat blocks and the monster manual entries any longer. I think this has an effect. This changes, the presentation of these guys from entities in a world that's through the wardrobe, that's through the looking glass, that's up in space just on the other side of the last starfighter. You've been recruited to go to space Narnia, little boy. Or is it all a dream? Is it a show? This is the question. This is the perception of like, well, what does it mean to be playing this game? And I used to think of it as, going through the doorway into Narnia, and that there was this sort of objectively sort of, obviously it's a fantasy that it exists, but, I'm sort of channeling that, and I'm offering people, this sort of gateway into a separate reality. I mean, not to get too quacky about like Carlos Castaneda stuff, but that's how I kind of looked at it. And so, I'm not really trying to entertain as a dungeon master so much as I'm trying to be vivid and be fair and representational and creative, and listen to that muse about what is in that world and then faithfully represent it. And I don't think that the game is really doing that. The game is not supporting goal-seeking monsters so much as it is supporting, an outcome. The game is not trying to answer questions about what sort of place this monster has in an ecological web. There's no ecology entry in the 5th edition Monster Manual, for example. How they reproduce, how many are appearing, what do they eat. That's not something which is there anymore. What if you want to like construct an actual whole forest, a whole trophic structure? What if you want to imagine a given area of your world and bring it to life, and maybe look at what sort of emergent structures the player characters might bump into? Who's the top dog in the forest? Just make it up. Just decide for yourself. You're the DM. You have the ultimate power after all. What do you need a stat block to answer that question for? And obviously you don't. You don't need a stat block. But isn't it useful when a stat block can answer things like that? Isn't that valuable? We've arrived at a place where that information is, and that world building, frankly, that magic of reading about it for the first time when I was a kid and learning about these creatures that don't exist, and having them portrayed as if they were in an almanac about birds, and given the same dignity as real things. It's different, and I think that has far-reaching consequences for the hobby. And it definitely makes this other way of looking at things seem more exceptional to folks out there, like those kids that Ivan is running 5th edition D&D for at the library. But what do you think? I'm going to turn on chat for a second, and I'm going to see who's been hanging out. How's it going? Be cool and hit the like button, guys. Yeah, that would be cool. I'm not sure if I'm going to actually leave this up or if I'm going to edit it or what. But it's been nice hanging out. I know this is a weird time and I didn't schedule this one or anything like that. But I hope that you had a good night, and perhaps I managed to prove a point. So, is everything nerfed in 5e? I think that that's a really good, way of asking the question. Is things are constructed to provide a satisfying experience, and for the flow to just go, and that is the overwhelming goal. To the point that at some points in the game, and some points in the development, they even considered having damage on a miss for the fighter, and that would make people feel better, or that that this would kind of create a more stable clock to combats. It's something which was considered, but the bounded accuracy, it really starts with bounded accuracy. It starts with the abundance of sources of advantage on player dice rolls, which makes success considerably more predictable. And within once it gets there, then it creates a limited space for the monster to stay alive in. They gave them a ton of extra HPs. They have their ACs are sort of artificially depressed in some cases, and that this is there to create a box, and then within that box, there's the stuff that's going on is to sometimes make sure that it seems like you actually fought an identifiable differential, like it feels different than A feels different than B. And so there's an urgent priority to sort of make sure that's there. It's not for the game master to role play so much as there's that list of actions. And I didn't provide a ton of visuals, and that's one of the reasons I'm not sure if I'm going to leave this up for wider consumption, because I didn't actually prove the point visually, which means some people are going to split hairs, and some people are going to zero in on that one thing that I said where the detail is just a little bit wrong, and then they're going to write 1,000 words about it, instead of thinking of my goal here, which is to talk about how, matter of fact, simulationist dungeon mastering, which considers a world which is animate and alive, is something which the game has moved away from, and that it seems more and more exceptionalist, and it seems more and more like that guy who plays the monsters that way is doing it wrong to beginners. And it means that this way of playing has more to explain of itself, and there's more of a learning curve for people coming from the other side, because there's just no examples of anybody. Are there any hot streamers that just say, like, enter the dungeon, like, live or die, let's see what happens? I don't think that there's any popular D&D streams which are like that. I mean, everybody understands it's a story, and that that it's really fun to watch the plot twists, and that the DM is gonna make sure that things are fun, rather than trusting that by running the game in a fair way, by role playing NPCs vividly, and describing environments that are evocative of the genre, that fun will just happen. This is important to me because I think that the simulationist, matter-of-fact way of playing, the world-building way of dungeon mastering, is more accepting of neurodiverse people, frankly. And it's personally important to me because I think that there's a huge amount of voices out there that have been very influential in the hobby that are, people who are on the autism spectrum, people like me who think faster than considering other people's feelings sometimes allows for, otherwise known as ADHD. And that when you have to think about other people's fun, and when you have to think about kind of being a hit, when the expectation is that you're there to razzle-dazzle and the rules are there to make sure that you are a razzle-dazzler, that, the rules are on your side as the dungeon master, as long as you want to do this particular thing, which is, be fun for other people, which you have to know what their fun is, rather than, let's play. Like, let's just get in here and play around in Narnia and see what happens. And I'll do my best. And I think that, I'll talk about this in future streams if people are interested. But for my part, I think that's the thing that we're really losing, which to me is of personal value. And there's more that might be of artistic value or heritage value, but let me know what you think. And I wish you a great night.